Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are diving into a microscopic, literal fraction of a second true crime story. We're going to look at exactly what happens when radiation hits a human cell. We'll break down the biology, the chemistry, and the physics of radiation damage to separate the hard facts from the fear.
To really wrap our heads around radiation, we have to zoom way in and speed way up to see that very first instant of contact between a particle and a human cell. You know, we usually think of radiation damage as this slow, creeping process, right? But the inciting incident actually happens in an unfathomably tiny window of time. So, what exactly is going on in that 15 decimal point sliver of a second? Well, it all kicks off with ionizing radiation. Think of it like a microscopic wrecking ball. Whether it's an X-ray, a gamma ray, or some fast-moving particle, it hits with absolutely blinding speed, packing enough punch to literally knock tightly bound electrons right out of their atomic orbits. When that electron gets knocked away, it leaves behind a positively charged atom and a newly freed electron. Together, we call these an ion pair. And that one single atomic disruption, that's the spark that lights the whole fire.
This initial spark sets off a terrifyingly fast chain reaction. Just look at this timeline. At 10 to the negative 15 seconds, you've got that initial physical ionization. Almost instantly, by 10 to the negative 9 seconds, we're into the chemistry, where highly reactive free radicals pop into existence and vanish just as fast. If the damage scales up, it takes hours for biological acute effects to show up as radiation sickness. And the wildest part? If a DNA mutation gets passed on, that timeline stretches from a billionth of a second to literal generations of genetic effects.
But how does that tiny physical spark cause so much biological chaos? Well, here is the crazy thing. Our own bodies actually become unwitting accomplices here. Why? Because we're made up of 70 to 85% water. When radiation enters the body, statistically, it's way more likely to hit a water molecule than anything else.
This leads us to the two distinct ways radiation attacks your cells: direct and indirect action. Radiation can act directly, kind of like a sniper hitting a critical target like DNA or RNA, ionizing it on the spot. But since we're practically walking bags of water, the vast majority of interactions are actually indirect attacks. The radiation hits a water molecule first, and the resulting chemical explosion is what really does the dirty work.
Notice the difference here. Down on the bottom right, direct action is that sniper bullet. The photon comes in, knocks an electron out, and blasts the DNA structure. But check out the indirect action above it. The photon hits a totally harmless water molecule. It strips an electron, creating an unstable ion pair. In a fraction of a second, these dissociate into free radicals, like that OH radical you see right there. These radicals can combine to form incredibly toxic stuff, like hydrogen peroxide, right inside your cell. It's these highly reactive chemicals that then turn around and assault the DNA.
So the absolutely crucial point is this: whether it's a direct physical strike or an indirect chemical bombing run by free radicals, the ultimate target in this microscopic warfare is your DNA. DNA is the master blueprint inside the nucleus of every single cell, encoding the thousands of proteins that keep you alive. Basically, if the blueprint gets destroyed, the whole building collapses.
Let's compare the pristine, ladder-like structure of normal DNA on the left, with its perfectly hydrogen-bonded base pairs, to the absolute chaos on the right. A single, relatively modest dose of radiation can cause over 1,000 lesions or base damages in just one cell. Base damage is bad, sure, but the critical danger? That lies in the actual physical breaks of the DNA strands themselves.
If you look closely at diagram B, a single strand break is often no big deal biologically. Why? Because your cell's enzymatic repair systems are incredibly smart. They act kind of like fixing a microscopic zipper, using the opposite intact strand as a template to patch the gap perfectly. But jump down to diagram D. If the radiation causes a double-strand break directly opposite each other, or even separated by just a few base pairs, the chromatin actually snaps into two completely separate pieces, and that is a catastrophic event for the cell.
Once that double-strand break happens, the cell is looking at a few possible fates. We might get lucky, and the radiation passes with no permanent damage. Or the cell's repair mechanisms perfectly stitch the DNA back together. On the extreme end, the damage is just too severe and the cell simply dies. But the most insidious fate for sure is the mutation. That's when the cell misrepairs the damage, survives, and reproduces in a corrupted form.
So how does this cellular failure snowball into actual disease? Well, if a normal cell suffers DNA damage from radiation and fails to repair it properly, it results in a mutation. If the cell's self-destruct mechanisms are also compromised, this mutated cell will undergo rapid, unregulated division. It crowds out normal cells, breaks through basement membranes, and invades the bloodstream. This microscopic misrepair is literally the foundational mechanism of how radiation causes cancer.
And this isn't just some abstract concept for a biology textbook. This cellular misbehavior is a major driver of global disease. To put that into perspective, in the developed world, 1 in 4 deaths are due to cancer. Now, obviously not all of these are caused by radiation, but understanding this fundamental pathway of DNA damage and unregulated division is absolutely key to grasping one of our greatest human health threats.
Section 2. From Cells to Syndromes, the Macroscopic Fallout.
To understand whole-body radiation sickness, you have to understand a fascinating biological quirk. Not all cells are created equal. Radiosensitivity is directly tied to how fast a cell grows. The damage hits the fastest-growing and dividing cells first. That's why stem cells, white blood cells, and the cells lining your intestines are highly sensitive. They're constantly reproducing. On the flip side, highly specialized, slow-growing cells like muscle and nerve cells are incredibly resistant to radiation. Because of this specific cellular sensitivity spectrum, as the radiation dose increases, we see a predictable, staged failure progressing across the body's systems, which we call acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. First, at lower doses, the bone marrow gets suppressed, causing hemopoietic syndrome, a massive drop in those highly sensitive white blood cells. If the dose is higher, the rapidly dividing cells of your gut lining die off, causing gastrointestinal syndrome. Finally, at massive doses, even the highly resistant nerve cells take a hit, leading to the inevitably fatal central nervous system syndrome.
So how do we stop this whole cascade from happening? Well, your actual risk of developing these fatal syndromes depends entirely on the dose rate and how you're exposed. For external incidents, mitigating risk relies on basic physics. Decrease your time of exposure, increase your distance from the source, and utilize heavy shielding. But we also have to protect against internal exposure. Radionuclides can enter the food chain, meaning we have to actively avoid inhaling radioactive dust or ingesting contaminated soil, water, and food.
The fundamental takeaway from the science of radiobiology is perfectly summed up in this quote: radiation should be handled with care, not with fear. When we pull back the curtain and really understand the exact microscopic mechanisms, how a photon creates a free radical, how that radical breaks a DNA strand, and how the cell attempts to repair it, we strip away the panic. Understanding it allows us to protect ourselves practically and effectively.
We are exposed to background radiation every single day, right? From the soil, cosmic rays, even the air we breathe. Knowing that this invisible ionizing energy is a constant presence in our environment, we really have to ask ourselves, how well do we truly appreciate the fragile yet utterly incredible repair systems working overtime, keeping our DNA intact and keeping us alive every single second of our lives? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the incredible science happening right inside your own cells.